Dateline, Deseret News, May 19th, 1869. Quote, "The 10th day of May, 1869, will form an epoch in the history of this country and in that of the whole civilized world, as the day on which the connecting tie of the Union and Central Pacific Railroad was laid, completing the great Transcontinental Highway and connecting the shores of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The vast importance of this wonderful work, when viewed in its ultimate consequences, cannot be apprehended by the most far-seeing minds. It is undoubtedly fraught with more momentous interest and destined to accomplish greater purposes than any work ever yet accomplished in any age by uninspired man. As a mere work of science and art, it far surpasses those boasted monuments of the Pharaoh ages, or any other memento of ancient engineering skill that now excites the wonder and admiration of the human mind. And when viewed from a utilitarian point of view, the latter sink into complete insignificance." End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolished Salt Lake, and a conversation about the Transcontinental Railroad with Chris Merritt from the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Hello and welcome to episode 21. I want to start off with a shout out to my newest Patreon followers, Mike and Caroline. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. If you're interested in my Patreon, there is a link in the show notes as well as a link on all of my social accounts. This is the first in a two-part episode of my conversation with Chris. As you will see, he is very knowledgeable about the Transcontinental Railroad and the Chinese railroad workers. Recording this interview was the highlight of my week, and I so enjoyed it. And I hope you do too. And on that note, here we go. I'm excited to welcome my friend Chris to the podcast today. Chris, would you introduce yourself, please?
Well, hi. My name is Chris Merritt. I'm the State Historic Preservation Officer here in Utah.
And Chris is also an expert on what we're going to talk about today.
I know a little bit about the Transcontinental Railroad, a little bit of archaeology.
Yeah, you know some, right?
A little bit.
Yeah, give him more credit, people. All right. So, who out there has been to the Golden Spike National Historic Monument? Raise your hand.
I'm raising my hand.
Yeah, I am too. It's in northern Utah, and if you haven't been there, you really need to because it's a really cool place. So along with the visitor center, there's a driving tour that you can take to see the sites of the important sites that were associated with the railroad, building the railroad. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. So we are going to, so I've invited Chris to help me tell the stories of the people and the places that built the railroad, because once again, he's the expert. All right, Chris, let's start with maybe an obvious question, but something that maybe you can give us a little more insight. Why was the Transcontinental Railroad so important?
Oh, that's a simple answer that only would take 2 to 3 days to get through. But when you look at the 19th century United States, we were really two disparate sections. We were the West Coast with the booming California gold fields in the 1850s. We have the Intermountain West, like where Utah is, that's just starting to be infilled with immigrants from the East Coast that are coming out here to start farms or to start mining. We have the Native Americans, obviously, that were here first as well, and they're all mixing in this Intermountain area. And then as you go further east, it becomes more and more populated, more and more settled. But there was really no connection between these two spaces to allow people and freight to move quickly. And as we entered into the Civil War era, that separation, that barrier became very evident. And starting in the 1850s, folks wanted to connect the East Coast to the West Coast with railroads. But it really took the Civil War to make it a national priority, because the president, Lincoln at the time, knew that if we could not connect the West Coast and its financial wealth, not to mention just hoping that we don't lose parts of the West to the Confederacy, if we didn't connect, we would probably lose large swaths of the West to the Civil War. We wouldn't be able to bankroll the Union forces as much without access to California gold. And so it really became a national priority in the 1860s, which led Lincoln and Congress to pass the Railway Act, the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, to spur the first ever sort of private public construction effort of this scale. 1,800 miles of potential railroad needed to be built. And so that's really why we wanted to build the railroad. And when we completed it, well after the Civil War in 1869, that's when the realization of the impact of the Transcontinental really hit, is that immigration into the Intermountain West doubled in a decade.
Wow.
Utah's population skyrocketed because of now, instead of taking hand carts and wagons across the plain, you can take a train and get there in a couple of days, where it took weeks and months to travel. So demographics changed. Utah's mineral wealth now had a market. We could get it on trains and get it out, copper, silver, gold. That also allowed money to go out, but money to come in. And we see the increasing amount of supplies and think about imported ceramics and bottleware and all this stuff that now someone could get from the railroad line instead of having it jostled for 1,000 miles across the plains.
Wow. And I can imagine our food, too. I mean, it changed the way that food production happened.
Yeah. I mean, it reshaped all of Utah's economy. And if we want to look myopically at just Utah, it fundamentally changed our economy from sort of an isolated backwater to now you're part of a global market with, you're thinking of sheep raising and ranching, being able to supply East and West Coast. You think about our mineral wealth. You think about coal. Suddenly, Utah became a major fixture in the national economy, which affected both us and outside Utah.
Wow. So major changes.
Fundamental
changes.
Even if you look at, the primary demographic in Utah pre-1869, were folks of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faith.
Sure.
Largely an agricultural focus. Well, the railroad access brought, even just the railroad workers brought a lot of demographic change.
Right.
With the different ethnicities, different religions. But then that spurred the increase in the mining. That's when you see, Bingham Canyon really explode is in the 1860s and 70s. And that changed Greeks and Italians and Slavs and all those folks start coming in by the late 19th century. And it was being spurred largely by that arrival of the railroad. And so our demographics changed, our religious landscape changed, our cultural landscape changed, all because this railroad showed up.
That's really cool. That you wouldn't, again, I said it's probably a simple answer, but you wouldn't think of all of those things. You just think, oh, the railroad just brought people, but not understanding what that people impact made.
Oh, yeah. And you could just keep talking about it for days, is think about how just even those people and things changed our environment, bringing invasive species like plants that have now taken over a lot of our rangeland. They came because the railroad brought all these new people and freight and material that it wouldn't have probably happened without that. So our cultural landscape, our physical landscape, our natural landscape changed because of this railroad in ways that we'll never even fully comprehend.
Oh, I bet. Okay. Awesome. No, that's a really cool background. I didn't even know a lot of that stuff, so that's really cool. All right, so let's start, since this is the first episode of my summer road trip series, so let's start just outside of Golden Spike in Corinne. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take that driving tour that you can take through the Golden Spike Park and hit some of those places where people actually can drive and see these places. Because I think, I've taken this tour before, and it's spectacular, but it's really hard to imagine what it actually looked like, what was going on. Were there towns, were there saloons, were there people, or was, just camps? And so that's why I'm excited to have you on, is kind of give us that visual so that when we take this tour, we can say, all right, now I see it.
Yeah, that's the fun part of archaeology. It's the fun and the complication of trying to convey things that are gone.
Right.
So people can start appreciating the depth. And I love starting in Corinne because there's still a town there. There's still a community there. Some of the other places we're going to be talking about, not so much a town there anymore.
No.
More rabbits than people, as I usually say. And I just want to reframe 1869.
Great.
We have The Central Pacific Railroad coming in from the west, coming in from Sacramento, entering Utah Territory in March of 1869, driving eastward towards Promontory. And we have the Union Pacific Railroad driving west from Omaha, Nebraska. They've been in Utah for a year at this point, working through Echo Canyon, Weaver Canyon, some really, really hard work coming into Ogden. That last stretch from Ogden to Promontory and really from Nevada to Promontory, that's where the race really occurs. You're kind of equidistant from Promontory for both companies. You're building as fast as you can. And as you head up I-15 corridor, I use the word corridor because that's even what it was back in the 19th century. It was a wagon road corridor. It was an Indian trail corridor. There was a lot of people moving through that landscape because you have a narrow strip of land between Great Salt Lake and the mountains. And the railroads went through that same corridor that I-15 goes through today. And as they moved out of Ogden going northbound, this is the area that we have a lot of the Mormon graders. That were contracted by the Union Pacific through Brigham Young to build railroad grade in 1869. And as you get to where Brigham City is, the railroad takes kind of a hard left, a hard west towards Promontory and Golden Spike National Historical Park. And Corinne is that first town west of Brigham. And you blow through there today, doing 55 on the state highway, and you don't see railroad. It's all gone. The community's still there, but you can see the legacy of the railroad in Corinne. As the railroads moved westward, they wanted a hub that was going to give them access to new markets, access to control. And we know a lot of the discussion of, Union Pacific intentionally tried to avoid Salt Lake City to avoid the impact of being associated with the LDS Church and the controls there and trying to support that. I mean, there's that aspect, but it was really economics. Building a railroad all the way south into Salt Lake and then back north versus just coming through Ogden just made more logistical sense.
Right.
But Corinne was hoped to be like the new Ogden.
Oh.
When
wow.
When the railroads were starting to boost, this new line, they were really hoping Corinne was going to be that crossroads of the West. They hoped it was just going to explode because it had lots of fresh water with the Bear River. It was undeveloped land, so they're not having to fight for land with, developed companies in Ogden.
Sure.
And never really played out that way.
Huh.
Corinne was a major community. I mean, it had well over 1,000 people at its peak in the 1870s after the railroad was finished. It was an instrumental part of connecting the railroad in Utah to Montana.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I did my dissertation up in Montana, and before I knew much about Utah history at all, I knew of Corinne because most of the freight and even Chinese laborers that went into Montana in the 1860s and 70s came out of Corinne and then across the Snake River Plain and then into Montana. So Corinne became a huge freighting hub in the 1870s until those communities up in the North Line, they got their rail access in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. So Corinne was a booming, bustling place. They call it the Gentile capital of Utah, a similar moniker we sometimes use for Ogden.
Right.
But it was because it was rough. There were saloons, there were brothels, there were gambling dens, there were shootings. It's one of those towns that everyone says it was the bloodiest town in the West for a while. You go through Corinne today, you don't have to worry about your safety.
It's a pretty sleepy little town now.
It's a sleepy little town because as the railroad shifted and as we go through some of these other lines, we'll probably touch on it, Corinne just never hit it big. There was always just more infrastructure in Ogden and Salt Lake that just drew the capitalism, better access to industrial manufacturing markets in those communities, which is what the railroad wanted. They wanted profit.
Right.
And so Corinne never died like some of these other towns, but it never got huge the way the railroads had envisioned. And as you enter Corinne, though, it's really interesting to think about, unlike a lot of other Utah communities, which are based on an agricultural plan, right, where you have a sort of a central grid and then it radiates from a town square out. The whole town's been created around the railroad.
Oh, wow.
And so if you drive through, there's like a couple, really great little restaurants and gas stations on the north side of the road. And then you look to the south and then there's kind of this empty space and then the town starts up again. Well, if you were there in the 1880s, that empty space would have made sense with 6, 7 lines of parallel track, freight depots, passenger depots, all in that space that once the railroad was abandoned, all was removed. But then behind that is where Main Street is. That's where the commercial district of Corinne is way beyond that because it was focused on the railroad, not the state highway. And so Corinne is that town where you have to get off the road because if you just stay on that state highway, you don't see Corinne.
You miss it.
You see really a 1960s or 70s Corinne. You don't see a 1870s Corinne, and you just need to kind of go slightly to the south and explore some of the older brick neighborhoods that are back there.
Yeah. So pretty rough and rugged town. I can imagine that a lot of different nationalities were there together, and saloons and prostitution and all that good stuff you think of when you think of a really wild and crazy Western town. Oh
yeah, and I was working with the water district up there on a project, and a man who worked for the water district, he was in his 70s at the time. His dad had worked in Corinne as a blacksmith. He never told anybody that he worked in Corinne. He was from Bear River City because he didn't want them thinking that he was going to such a dirty and unholy town.
Oh, wow.
So even some of his family didn't know that his actual job was in Corinne because he didn't want that character attached to him.
Sure.
But it tells you the depth of how we can, make these communities have a reputation that even by the point that his dad was working there, it was more of an agricultural town. But the stigma of Corinne had existed 50 years after its heyday.
Right. And after everything had gone and it had settled down, but it was still, that's Corinne.
Yeah. He's just like, I work in Bear River City.
Yeah, right?
But yeah, and you think about the ethnicities and Corinne, 1870, the next federal census year, right, was the year after the railroad was completed. So it's such a great little time capsule, just a year after it was built. Corinne is really cosmopolitan. You have people from around the globe. It was the largest Chinatown in Utah in 1870. It had the most Chinese women in Utah in 1870. So it had families as well. But you also have all the other soup of humanity that came on the railroad. Yes, you had the LDS, but you had the Irish, you had the Welsh, you had African Americans. You had everybody in Corinne because it was that community that was centered around railroad and the opportunity that provided all these new groups.
So was Corinne a place where a lot of the people, they had settled their families and then left Corinne to go work the other places on the railroad? Was that?
Sometimes, yeah. So some of these very rural stations, a lot of families didn't want to necessarily move to.
Right.
But most people that lived in Corinne, there was a life in Corinne for them.
Okay.
Especially when you look at families. This was a booming, bustling male town on many levels.
Sure.
This was a boom town. We use an analog today of the oil fields up in North Dakota that were so big a decade ago. Mm-hmm. They were following such an American West pattern of all these men in their 20s going up there to make it rich in the oil field. These railroad towns were the same thing. All these men looking for opportunity, looking for jobs, looking to hit it rich, getting suckered into saloons and gambling and,
Sure.
and the vices that those bring. But yeah, there were families, but a lot of the railroad workers that lived in Corinne had their families in their Corinne with them, other than the Chinese who were barred from really bringing their families to the United States because of various legal actions in the 19th century. But generally, Corinne, the railroad workers had their families nearby, unless they were truly those bachelor working on the rail.
Sure. So we wanted the Chinese railroad workers, but we didn't want their families.
Yeah, it's a story that sadly repeats. When you look at capitalism, we love cheap labor.
Right.
And the cheapest labor is usually immigrant labor, uneducated labor, labor that you can exploit. And so the Chinese labor was really fitting that major need. When you look at the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in a quick lens, when they started from Sacramento in 1863, they were using European and American crews. They were not using Chinese crews because they thought, one, that they weren't physically capable
mm-hmm.
of building the railroad because we had this image of the Chinese being slight and weak. But by 1864, they'd been experimented with by some of the section crews, and they're like, these guys work harder and more communally than the white folks, because every time there's a gold strike, we lose all our white workforce to the mountains.
Right, okay.
Versus the Chinese, who can't really go do that, they're happy to keep working for that day wage and happy to kind of keep to themselves because of the surrounding racism.
Sure.
Forced them into themselves as well. So at that point, Charles Crocker and Leland Stanford famously said, we want 15,000.
Wow.
By next year at this point. And they got between 13 and 15,000 within a year from China. And that really did shape the story of the Transcontinental Railroad and Utah's history, is that huge influx of cheap Chinese labor that were mostly male.
Okay.
1874, the United States passed the Page Act, which blocked immigration of Chinese women and children. Again, a reflection that we wanted the cheap male labor, but we don't want you to stay.
Right. Just come build our railroad and then go back to back to where you came from.
Yep. And all the racism that embedded is, the justification of the Page Act was to say that all the Chinese women being brought to the United States were just prostitutes. So it's actually in their best interest.
Right.
That we didn't allow this anymore.
Right.
That's a good justification for an end.
Yeah. Very, very different time back then.
Yes. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Not to go dark.
Well, it's part of the history, right? Mm-hmm. History is dark.
Yeah, it is. It's dark. It's dirty. It's
gritty.
It's happy. It's sad.
Got it all.
Yeah. And Corinne was one of those towns that had it all. And if we fast forward, when we look after the abandonment of the promontory branch of the railroad, which we consider really from the Nevada border up around Great Salt Lake, through Golden Spike, through Corinne, and to Brigham City. That was kind of the core promontory branch. That was largely abandoned in the early 20th century after the construction of Lucing Cutoff that went right across Great Salt Lake. It was left open, and there was regular railroad service from 1904 until 1942 for most of this stretch because there were needs to get things out. And at Corinne, one of the things that's interesting, one of the major exports from Corinne after really 1900 was sugar beets. And Corinne was a major hub for shipping sugar beets out to the railroad. And there's some really cool historic photos of the big sugar bins in Corinne and Corinne Junction, which was right there.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, sugar beets were huge. My grandpa worked on a sugar beet farm in Gunnison, Utah, so I know all about sugar beets.
and you needed to get those beets to market, and the railroad was the best way to do it. And so that's what kept the railroad alive in Corinne into the World War II.
Okay, so when was Corinne's? So about the 40s was when Corinne started seeing a decline? Yeah,
well, it like all Western towns, it went through booms and busts.
Sure.
If you wanted to say that if there was a heyday of Corinne, it was the 1870s.
Okay.
If you want to say there was a low point in Corinne, I would say, the Depression through World War II.
Sure.
Just as the market shifted, as labor shifted. But, unlike a lot of the other towns along this promontory branch, Corinne continued. And that was because there were agricultural roots to keep people grounded in that community. And proximity to Brigham City allowed it to be a bedroom community by the 1960s and 70s.
Sure.
So we just kind of leveled out Corinne's life at that point.
Got it. Okay.
But it's gone through ups and downs. But I just love Corinne. It has some of the coolest historic buildings in the state. Mm-hmm. It has the oldest non-LDS church still standing.
Yes.
1870. I think it was in a Methodist church.
I believe that's correct too.
And it's still there. And the community is now investing in that church to get it reactivated as a community center.
That's awesome.
And that's cool. That's honoring our history but making it part of today.
Right. Which is what preservation's all about, right?
That's what we keep saying.
Right. That's what we're pushing here, people. So Corinne's going to be like if you gas up, get something to eat, get some drinks, because once you head in towards the park, and if you take this whole route, you're gonna want to gas up before you leave Corinne.
Yeah, Corinne's your last, I don't know, quote unquote civilization. west from I-15. So it's a great place to grab a burger, grab some gas.
Yeah. Go see the sights.
Go see the sights. Go look at downtown. Get off the interstate. Get off the main part of the state drag. Because as you go west of Corinne, you're entering sort of the northeast branch of Great Salt Lake. Mm-hmm. You're going to smell that, and then you're going to see that.
Right.
This time of year, you're going to be covered in biting gnats and mosquitoes,
right,
and horse flies and everything else. But the railroad went through there, and as you drive west out of Corinne, you can just kind of train yourself to look for a non-natural looking berm off to your south, off to your left, and you'll be able to see the old line running parallel to you. Mm-hmm. There's no rail on it anymore. There's no ties. Those were all ripped up in 1943. But you'll be able to kind of follow that line all the way to used to be Orbital ATK, now it's Northrop Grumman,
right,
the big missile testing and R&D facility. And at that point, you kind of go off and go up into Golden Spike. But if you keep going on that highway past ATK or Northrop Grumman, you'll see the big oxbow of the railroad that had to take the railroad from the bottomlands all the way up over Promontory Summit. And so this created this huge 8-mile long curve and grade because you couldn't do a steam engine at a high grade.
Okay.
So you had to do a real slow, gentle curve. Again, all these big, gentle curves and summits are the reason they went across the lake in 1904 because it was a straight shot and it was flat.
Exactly.
But yeah, if you train your eye to look for something, you'll see it and the modified landscape of this railroad berm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, once you leave Corinne, you're going more into ruralness.
Yeah. Okay, so I think our first stop out of Corinne would be Big Phil.
Yeah, so Big Phil and Big Trestle.
There you go. Yeah, Big Trestle.
This is where the famous passing of each other really hit its high mark. Is if you recycle yourself to April 1869, and you're now 5 years into construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Congress never said where the finish point was supposed to be.
They left that little detail out. Huh?
They just left that out. And railroad companies who were getting paid by the mile, getting bonds by the mile from the federal government, the workers were getting paid by the mile. Well, they're like, if there's no stopping point, we're just going to keep going.
Just keep building. Keep going.
And that's one of the coolest things preserved in Golden Spike National Historical Park to me is this is where not only were they doing survey work, but they were building physical railroad grade, cutting through mountains within yards of each other, even though there's supposed to be one line. And it was because they were just, exploiting the system.
Right.
And it took a special act of Congress in 1869, April, to have them say, Promontory Summit's the finish line, knock it off.
Quit building the railroad.
Quit building it. But it's crazy to think about that, for almost 200 miles, there was an overlap.
Oh, geez.
I mean, it wasn't as fully built as what you see at Promontory, but there were cuts, there were berms, there were surveyors in Evanston and Wells, Nevada, for the other railroad. They were planning that far ahead because they're just going to keep going until they get told to stop.
So the trains would just pass each other. They'd wave as they passed by.
Right.
Hey, Charlie, how's your day?
and it makes total sense. And you're going to exploit the system. And so,
well, yeah.
And so Big Phil, cycling it back to that, Big Phil was the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, and it is a massive pile of dirt. And there's this really big natural cut in the Promontory Mountains that they had to span. Well, the Central Pacific spanned that with dirt.
Okay.
Filling it in from the ground up to create a nice flat level plain for the railroad to cross.
Now, we're talking men using shovels and, hard basic labor to fill this in.
Yeah, this was human and animal labor.
Wow.
Very, very minimal investment of steam power other than moving equipment to the front. So shovels, blasting power, wheelbarrows, horses with wagons with dumps on them. Yeah, this 100-foot tall pile of rock and debris was put there by hand.
By hand.
By thousands of workers of every nationality and ethnicity possible. Obviously the Central Pacific, was largely a Chinese-based crew, so a lot of the Chinese were working on that. But 50 yards from the Big Phil was where they put the Big Trestle. for the Union Pacific Railroad.
So one chose one way, and the other one chose a different way.
Yeah, it's like that science fair, right? When you're a kid and like you have to figure out a way to get an egg safely to drop from the roof of a building.
Right.
Everyone comes up with their own solution.
Exactly.
and that's what the two railroads did here. And it ended up being the fill was just safer. You know, the engineers and like some of the VIPs for the Union Pacific Railroad were like, we're not going across that trestle.
Well, there's a lot when you talk about a trestle because you're talking about like, you know, how fast the train goes over, how loaded the train is, and how quickly all the bolts and, you know, all that vibrate out of where they're, you know, nailed or bolted in and the wood and the structure.
And that's a lot of things. It's like the 1869 push was speed, not quality.
Right. So they're building it as fast as I wouldn't even walk across that.
Well, there's some really great stories of some of these engineers just saying, yeah, I saw the train in front of me just do this like 10-foot wobble on top of the trestle as the whole thing was just wobbling. And so one guy just got out and walked. He's like, I'm not going to do it. And it's like these guys had some steel, you know, in their blood to be able to go across those. But suddenly they thought, hey, that big pile of rock is a lot safer than this little Lincoln log thing over here.
Seriously. It's like a school science experiment, right?
Yeah.
Build a trestle. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to use that guy's experiment, not that guy's experiment.
Right.
But yeah, the big fill is just, it's the largest fill on the Transcontinental Railroad. Outside the Sierras. The Sierras has a really big one right by the Big Donner Summit tunnels. But it's just an amazing, just to see it in the land. And it's so massive that when you drive up to it, you think it's natural. It looks like it's part of the mountain.
Yep.
And you have to take the Big Fill Trail to really get an appreciation.
Take the trail, people, because, you won't get a really good understanding unless you get to it. So, yeah, I agree. The trail is the key here.
And it's a short trail. It's flat because you walk on the railroad.
Exactly. It's a great trail.
It's a nice flat rail or trail. It's pretty accessible for anybody of any age. But you can walk out there and you get away from the road and you can just see the amount of human investment that was put into these things, and you can feel it.
And there's an energy out there.
Oh, yeah.
There definitely is. I mean, there could not be any, leftover energy. There has to be because of all of the manpower that was put in there, all the time and everybody. And there's definitely an energy out there that you get kind of a tingle when you look at it and you think about that.
And that's the fun part of history is when you can be in a landscape so austere and blank in most mindsets. Like you drop somebody from Iowa here, they're like, this is a pretty blank landscape. It's like you can feel the history though in that landscape because so little has changed that you can really transport yourself back and think of those labors and think of all the different languages and voices and the horses and the blasting powder. And just you can feel that if you take the time to think about it.
The chaos of it all.
Yeah, the sound. Like, can you imagine the sound of 3,000 guys, blasting powder, wagons, horses, all that?
No, you just can't. I don't think you can. And at the same time, you have the other railroad building the trestle. So it's what they're doing too. So what happened to the trestles? They just abandoned it and eventually it just kind of fell apart on its own?
Yeah. Shortly after the fancy Golden Spike event on May 10th, 1869, the government selected the preferred route. So there was one line.
We're going to select the one that's least likely to kill people.
And so, the Central Pacific line was selected through Golden Spike, and then all the way into basically Corinne was kind of where they selected the Central Pacific or the Union Pacific grade. Okay. And the trestle was, the history doesn't really say, but I assume it was disassembled and reused in other places because you still needed wooden bridges. You still needed all that wood from this giant.
Yeah, you're not gonna leave it alone.
Yeah, no. And then from 1860 or 1870 to the 1930s, all the trains went on the Big Fill.
Okay. So would the people be camping there? I mean, as they're working on the fill, is that where they would be living? So they would set up tents and have camps and.
Well, and again, it makes you picture how many people, where are they living, how are they eating? Right. There's some really great historic photos. Charles Savage has one of like Death Camp, which is below the Big Fill, and it's just this sea of bleached out cow bones. And that was from the walking commissary to feed the workers, where they would just butcher them on site. But you don't think about that because we're so used in our world living at home, eating at home, and then going to work. Well, in post-pandemic world, what does that mean?
Right.
Work and life are separate things.
Sure.
But now this is like you're there 10, 12 hours a day. You're eating on site. You're doing everything right there. And so, just ringing the Big Phil are just hundreds of dugouts and tent platforms and all this stuff that, generally aren't visible by the public because of worries of looting and vandalism to the archaeological history.
Sure.
But there's camps all over those hills because you had 3,000 potential workers in an area that's a quarter mile square.
So was there division of labor within these camps? I mean, you had cooks. These were the cooks. Mm-hmm. These were the people that would do your laundry and
the railroad was very efficient because they had very clear lines on division of labor. Now, some of that was very, racial stereotyping.
Of course.
Certain people could never rise above their station. And in this case, the Chinese could never really rise above grunt labor for building the grade. So when I say grade, I'm talking physically the alignment of the railroad.
Okay.
And that could be a fill, like what we just talked about, where you're raising up dirt. Mm-hmm. It could be a cut where you're cutting through a mountain, which for the Big Phil, you actually walk through a cut to get to the fill.
Yeah.
A lot of that rock went into the fill. And so the grade, which is that ballast, that rock, is largely it would have been done on the Central Pacific side by the Chinese workforce.
Okay.
And then on top of that, you have the railroad ties and the rail. Track layers were actually a different sort of category of workers than the ballast and the graders, and because it just took different skills, they were responsible for different tasks. So it's like a very well-oiled machine factory to build a railroad.
Everyone had their job or assignment, and that's what you did.
And then you had blacksmiths, you had cooks, you had stonemasons, you had carpenters, you had surveyors, you had engineers. Everybody had their job. And without that organization, the 10-mile day feat.
Yes, we'll talk about that. That's exciting.
Wouldn't have been done without this level of organization.
Absolutely. Oh, you needed to run a tight ship to have that happen.
And when we talk about the 10 mile, we don't want to overshadow that the Union Pacific built 7 miles in a day.
Oh.
That's why we had to build 10 on the Central Pacific side, because there was a duel going on.
Well, there was a bet, right?
Yeah, there was a huge bet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, so from the Big Phil, we head over to Chinese Arch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Chinese Arch is sort of an anachronism in history to me. So it's on the East Auto Loop. So if you're going into Golden Spike, the Big Phil trailhead would be on your right, the north side of the road. But on the left, you'll see the railroad comes around a little spit of land, a little peninsula. And if you go just another half a mile, there's the beginning of the East Auto Loop. And it just kind of brings you back to that Big Phil parking lot just on the south side. And you drive on the actual physical railroad grade. So you're kind of pretending to be a choo-choo train in your car.
You got to make the noises as you go, right?
You totally do. And I've never done that myself.
No. And I didn't either.
Never.
I didn't buy a train whistle and
have somebody lean out the other window and but that auto tour is
next time.
It also gives you a great view of Great Salt Lake, and it's a sweeping view to the south.
Right.
But in between the beginning and the end of that loop, there is this little natural arch in the limestone, and for a very long time, it was called Chinaman's Arch, which is a very derogatory 19th century term for how we referred to the Chinese.
Right.
And the Chinese descendant community in Utah actually successfully lobbied to get that name officially changed to Chinese Arch, a more appropriate use of that term.
That's recently, correct?
Yeah, it's about 15 years ago at this point, mid-2000s, that finally changed. And, it's more appropriate.
Absolutely.
But this is where history diverges a bit. I don't know why it's called Chinese Arch. No one does.
No one does, huh?
They've explored it. There's really no indication of a railroad worker camp there from the Chinese perspective, because the archaeology doesn't show one.
Okay.
And so it's kind of a vague question mark in history. Is like, why did, of all this landscape between Sacramento and Omaha. Why did this one little 8-foot tall arch get the moniker Chinese arch? I don't know that answer.
Wow.
But I do know that because of its location in the park, the Chinese community do see it as a point of reverence for their ancestors. And the modern Chinese community does visit that arch during the May 10th events.
Yes.
To honor the ancestors. So whether there was a direct connection to the Chinese or if it was just an offhanded comment by some railroad employee, it stuck. And to the community today, it is still a place that you can remember your past and honor those that worked on this railroad. So it's an interesting little stop.
Right. But it's become this beautiful remembrance of what the Chinese railroad workers went through and what they did. And and it's nice for their descendants to have a place to go as well to remember.
Yeah, if you think about it on a national level, like there's places to go see Leland Stanford's history and Charles Crocker's history, and there's monuments to the Irish, and there's monuments to these other groups that built on the railroad.
Right.
Statues and libraries and stuff. What did the Chinese have in that honorific sense? And that's where the Chinese Arch started. And then we're hoping to expand that, by expanding interpretation, expanding like the Golden Spikes National Park Service Visitor Center is getting brand new exhibits, which are going to be a lot more 21st century, much more inclusive in tone and recognition. But the arch played that physical monumentation for the Chinese community for a long time when they were being excluded from a lot of other physical places. Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that, we talked about getting across is how important the Chinese were to building this railroad. Because I don't think a lot of people make that connection, or make a connection to really anyone who built the railroad. I mean, we're talking 1860s, people don't even make a connection to 2000. So
valid.
So it's hard to understand like how important all of these this imported labor was.
That's an important thread. And we're all at fault in that too, is you look at the way the railroad was written about the history of the railroads,
right.
the stories we tell, the honoring ceremonies for a very long time, 100 years or more. It was about the guys who paid for it.
Yep.
The guys who, sponsored it, maybe some of the engineers, but that's about as far down the pecking order as the recognition continued. The laborers were nothing more than the verbs in the sentence.
Right.
The nouns were the money.
Yeah.
The nouns were the big names, the people that have universities named after them. Right?
Yeah, right. It's the old white man history.
Exactly. And since the 1970s, we've slowly shifted that narrative. And then the 80s, Western history really took off and expanded its scope into the underrepresented groups.
Yes.
And in that case, it's women, it's children. It's not just ethnicities were excluded from those narratives.
Sure.
And now you look at the ceremonies that we had in 2019, and this year, it's so much more inclusive.
Which is
everybody
fantastic.
Can see their selves and their family's history in these ceremonies.
Right.
And that's a major change that hopefully when, kids get my age, they're going to have a different way of relating to the railroad than I did when I first started hearing about the Transcontinental Railroad story of like, oh, there's this big railroad, but here's all these famous people.
Right.
Like instead of like, well, here's this really cool railroad built by all these faceless people, and then there's some other folks.
Yeah, and some guys that told them what to do.
Yeah, it's like I think that's fair, and I think it creates a space for everybody.
I think so too.
Because you can't downplay the role of Stanford and Crocker and Durant and all these guys.
Right, and these were all the guys that were the heads of the railroad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so you need to recognize them, but they don't have to be the end of the recognition. And that's where we're getting.
Which is fantastic. And that's what I like to do with the podcast is like recognize people that don't always get, their story told. So.
And maybe on that, before we leave that
Sure.
point, when we look at the way the Chinese were treated by the railroads or even the non-railroads, there is no name there are no names for these workers. Most of the workers that were employed by the Central Pacific Railroad, if they were Chinese, they were numbers. Because of the way they organized the labor, the railroad would pay headmen, head Chinese workers, and they'd say, okay, we're giving you $100, go find us 100 Chinese. And unlike their white labor, where they had the names, the ages, the occupations, and roles, the Chinese were just docket numbers. And so we might get the names of the labor contractors, or maybe, lucky if we get the work gang leader's name, but the bulk of those 13 to 15,000 Chinese workers, we have no real name to associate with them. And for somebody of my descent, a European descent, I am in such a privileged place when I start doing genealogy.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Because my ancestors were tracked, even though they screwed up our names in places.
Mine too. Totally.
But I have a chance.
Yeah.
These Chinese workers had so little care to who they were as people. They were numbers. They were, I hate to say it in such a term, but they were nothing more than a shovel and a pick to a lot of the railroad company officials, even though many of them recognized that they couldn't have done this without the Chinese labor.
They were labor. That's all they were.
But they were faceless labor.
Yeah.
And why would we invest more in that than that? And
I didn't even realize that there was a difference just in documentation between the Chinese and everyone else. Oh, wow.
And even when we get names, because of the cultural divide between English and Cantonese or Mandarin today, we butchered their names to a point where we can't even decipher that.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's ways, and you look at Dr. Gordon Chang's work out of Stanford, and he's an amazing historian. But what he's able to publish on names of workers or their lives, a handful out of 15,000.
Wow.
We can do that kind of work with. That's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. So even more important that we change our narrative to reflect who was involved and get their story out.
And it makes us as professional preservationists, we have to change our toolkit.
Right.
On how we interpret.
Right.
We recognize that they don't have names, but we can't just perpetuate that. Like, how do we tell a story that's personal when we don't have people? It's such a weird and hard thing to do. And that's, as an archaeologist, I feel is one of our powers.
Right, because you can dig up the evidence.
Right. I can dig up a person's life.
Right.
Not a census line.
You can dig up the plates, the opium, the pipes and forks, and we'll talk about some of that stuff that you have found, because it's really cool that still exists.
Yeah, it still exists, and in many ways, it's the only way we can tell a personal story.
Right.
And we need to recognize that and make sure that we do a good job by it.
I agree. You guys are doing fantastic.
Well, it takes a village. There's a lot of us pulling that rope.
Right. Okay, so from here we go to the Golden Spike National Monument, or Park, Visitor Center. And this is where you can see
the choo-choos.
The choo-choos. And they run. They're running, and everyone's... do they still do it like daily where they turn them on, or...
Yeah, generally most days during the busy season, they will have those trains running. And it's a reconstruction for those of you who haven't been. Shame on you. It's an amazing experience, because it is a way to start filling in your mind with how big things were and how loud things were and how they smelled, by seeing these reconstructed trains.
Yes, yeah.
And in the case of Golden Spike, we have a reconstruction of the two trains that were there at the May 10th, 1869 ceremony. Both of those trains actually went on to have a very long, healthy service life.
Oh, wow.
And were deconstructed at some point in their history.
That's funny, right? I mean, here was these two really important trains, and it was like, oh yeah, we got our picture, now go put them to use, and just gone to history.
It's not the gold shovel, and we're going to put it on a plaque.
It's like, not the spike that everyone signed.
Exactly. But what you see is the Jupiter which was the Central Pacific's train at the ceremony that came from the west, and then the 119, which is the Union Pacific's railroad engine. One was coal-fueled, one was wood-fueled, kind of showing the different trajectories of the two railroads. And they are meticulously reconstructed.
They're amazing.
They're meticulously maintained. There is a passionate group of foamers, is what I call them. It's a very popular and very respectful name to people that foam at the mouth when trains come up. But they just volunteers and National Park Service staff just lovingly take care of those trains because it is kind of the visitor experience.
Exactly.
At Golden Spike National Historical Park are those reconstructed trains. The visitor center's a 1960s era visitor center.
It's groovy.
It's groovy, but it's going to go through a multi-year renovation.
I read that.
And we're very excited. They've been working with our office closely because it is a historic building.
Thank you.
And so we're finding ways that they can modernize their exhibit space, they can modernize the visitor flow, but still honor that 1960s architecture.
Right, because that 60s architecture is the national park architecture, right? I mean, that's what I grew up going to these national parks. And when we pulled up in front of that visitor center, I was like, I know I'm at a national park visitor center just by looking at it.
Yeah, and it's funky, it's old, and dusting off of it will be really good. But,
right.
It's such a cool little visitor center, and the Park Service staff out there are just amazing.
They are fantastic.
And if you go up there on usually the May 10th weekend, usually it's multiple days, they do full reenactments of the May 10th ceremony with actors.
It is so much fun.
It's just great.
It's just so much fun to go. It's it's kitschy, but it's so much fun.
Oh yeah, and you're standing next to trains and you can take your photos with it. They redo the champagne photo, the classic historic photo. It's just a fun time. But, a lot of folks, though, and that's where I'm glad you started with Chinese Arch and Big Phil, most people go to the park, see the trains, leave.
And then they leave. They don't understand that you're missing out.
There's other pieces of this that are, largely accessible for families. All the trails, all the hiking is pretty flat, pretty easy.
Yeah.
But it does give you additional perspective.
Yes. And in this auto tour that we're kind of taking people on, I did it in my car. So, there are some off-road places if you want to get your few gallons of gas stored away and some extra tires and you want to go the off-roading route, you can do that too. But this one that we're taking on is really accessible.
Super, super accessible. And it's a national treasure. This whole landscape we're talking about is there's no other place in the country that you can see this.
Right.
There's no other place that this much of the transcontinental alignment is preserved and publicly accessible, let alone you can drive on portions.
Yeah.
So it's really a hidden treasure that without podcasts, without some interpretation, I don't think a lot of visitors really comprehend the connection that they're making with that past. And how many people go to Spiral Jetty and drive through the park and not even stop and learn about the railroad?
Right. And that's the thing, Spiral Jetty's cool, but, that's another part of this whole area that, people or the people that take the route and don't just kind of take that jog and go over to Spiral Jetty. It's kind of you're missing out on seeing all of the sites. Yeah,
and I'm the bigger nerd there. You go to Spiral Jetty and that's neat. I'm going to go look at the old petroleum drilling from the 1920s because most folks don't know that there was a oil rush on Great Salt Lake in the 19-teens and 20s. And and it's right next to Spiral Jetty.
It's right there. You can see the remnants of it.
Yeah, just don't let your dog run through it. It's problematic. It's a lot of tar coming out of the ground.
Oh, poor puppy. So you mentioned, at the visitor center, the picture. The famous picture of, the champagne toast. My great-great-grandfather supposedly is in that picture. And they have two names down for this person. One is my grandfather and one's a different name. And so we're not quite sure if it was actually him or not. My family, of course, we're going to take it and run with it.
Right,
because,
You should.
We should. But it's interesting. I only found that out at the 150th anniversary.
Well, and I don't know how I've done so many tours out there and taken so many folks, so many things. Oh yeah, my person's in the photo and my great grandfather and I think that's great. That one, the photos blur in a few places and people can see what they want in it. But the growing appreciation for those other random people that were in the photo is great. It's just another layer of how the connectivity occurs. And the 2019 150th anniversary, I think, took access to this story and broadened it and made it exciting again and got people interested again.
Right.
And part of everything that we've done out there between the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management and our office here at the state has been to keep that energy.
Yes.
Let's not just do the classic American thing of have our 30 seconds of attention span and then move on. There's so much to learn out there, so many cool places to see and go visit multiple times.
Right. Well, I asked my mom, I'm like, how do we know, it was great-great-grandfather? And she's like, oh, it's just a story that's been told. We don't know. There's no research. There's no journal entry. There's nothing to say that he was in this photo. It's just so weird. It's random. It's this random thing. But I like that people can go there and they can see the photo and it has a list of the prominent people that are in the photo. And you can put a name to the people. But again, it was missing the actual people that made it happen.
Yeah, that's the segue into who's not in the photo.
Who's not in the photo? Who are we missing? Congratulating.
Yep, and there's multiple reasons for that. There's no doubt in my mind that it was an intentional exclusion to have Chinese workers in that photo. There also wasn't a lot of Irish workers in that photo. A lot of the folks that are mentioned, even those that say, "Oh yeah, my great grandfather," in there, they were not the workers.
No, my grandfather had nothing to do with the great-grandfather, nothing to do with the railroad.
And it's not to say that the Chinese got the short end of the racism stick in this, but really that May 10th event is a celebration of the capitalists and the boosters.
Right. Right.
Doesn't mean that that's not a great day to go visit and that you can't still think outside that box, but that whole event was construed to be a PR publicity win. And
totally.
And we need to recognize that.
Right.
And say, okay, well, where are these folks?
Right.
Well, those folks are actually still working.
Yeah, they're still building the railroad. They've just moved on.
You had 8,000 potential Chinese workers by the time the May 10th ceremony, completed. You're not going to have them just sitting around at Golden Spike waiting for a photo op.
Right.
This is a living, breathing railroad.
They're working.
Now every day you're done and you're not moving trains, you're losing money.
Right.
So, those workers were already back trying to improve those rickety trestles or fills that had collapsed in a freak flood.
Oh, wow.
It's like a lot of these folks were going right back to work. I mean, a bunch of the Chinese workers were discharged after the completion. So were a lot of the other non-Chinese workers.
And where did they go after?
Everywhere. It was like locusts. Suddenly, you had not only all these immigrants from China, but all these other immigrants who probably didn't have the money to come out west necessarily on their own. Now they're in the middle of Utah and they don't have a job. So they just went everywhere. And you look at some of the boom-bust mining camps of that 1869, 1870 period, Elko. A lot of the mine camps around Elko boomed. Tuscarora, which is north of Elko, had a huge Chinatown in the 1870s, and they were mostly railroad veterans. And so they just moved into these other economic opportunities. Yes, the railroad brought them there, but they moved into mining. They moved into restaurants, laundries. A lot of the non-Chinese that went into agriculture and married locals and became part of the community in a different sense. And so, that major push of humanity just kind of then spread throughout the American West. And, it was that dream of like, I'm going to get out west and I'm going to make it rich. And I'm going to go explore and try to make my own $1 million find.
Sure.
And everybody had to do it in their own special way.
That's really cool. So when you were saying that, I was thinking of that Schoolhouse Rock episode about the big melting pot.
Yeah.
How we just kind of all came together and...
Yeah, I think the way that I always have preferred it from some of my human geographer friends, it's more of a stew than a soup. we were a little chunky. There was some blending of flavors,
right,
but
right.
you're still a carrot.
Right, right. It's true.
In the 19th century, and it perpetuated itself in its many ways of these ethnic enclaves forming in these rural towns of folks that had different ethnic or religious backgrounds, and it was just. I love talking about it because I hopefully can inform people to think about how we don't do this again with our next immigrant wave or our current immigrant wave of making sure we don't put people in boxes just because they don't speak like we do.
Exactly.
Or they don't practice religion like we do. And, that's why I feel really good in Utah that we have generally a pretty open community when it comes to folks of different ethnic and religious backgrounds, but we're all human.
Exactly.
And we like to put others in boxes.
Yes, we like the other.
Yes. Well, it's, I think, truly a deeply bad part of humanity.
It's something that's hard to get past and to break out of.
Yeah. And you even look at chimpanzees and they do it. Right? There's ins and outs.
Right.
You're in the group or you're out of the group.
Well, and we know that like Ogden had a huge Chinese community. Salt Lake had a huge Chinese community. So would some of those people have come from the railroads and
absolutely
those communities?
And Ogden in particular had a direct, it
was just down the road.
Yeah, it was on the Transcon. So, Ogden was no different than Corinne in the sense that it was a railroad town and those were railroad workers and they were there. Salt Lake, where we got railroad access a little later, there were Chinese railroad workers in Salt Lake. The Denver and Rio Grande, Western that arrived in 1882 had Chinese workers building it all the way from Grand Junction.
Wow, okay.
So, there was an influence of Chinese coming from that direction. Salt Lake's Plum Alley sometimes gets a lot of the press, but it was kind of a late Chinatown in Utah's history.
Wow, okay.
Ogden and Corinne really went first, and then Salt Lake City became a collection point for a lot of other Chinese laborers as the late 19th century. Plum Alley doesn't really become a thing until the late 1880s.
Yeah.
And then became more popular in the 90s and teens.
Sure. And we are going to stop there for now. Stay tuned to part 2 of my conversation with Chris, coming soon. Make sure to follow my Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolished Salt Lake Podcast to see some really great historic photos of the railroad and its workers. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at Demolished SL Pod. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe. Check out the show notes for links to a bunch of resources for Utah SHPO, Golden Spike National Historic Park, the Transcontinental Railroad publications, and driving maps. And on that note, I will see you soon.